It started with a crack in the ice and ended with 6 hearts beating as one, a struggling single dad, 3 little girls under frozen water, and a mother whose secrets arrived in 10 Rolls-Royces. What happened in the hours that followed melted more than just the snow. It thawed. Grief rewrote destiny and built a family no one saw coming. So settle in, take a breath, and let this story warm your soul. If heartfelt stories of kindness, healing, and second chances speak to you, don't forget to subscribe to Soul Moment Story for more tales that remind us. Sometimes it's the quietest acts of love that echo the loudest. The cold that morning was the kind that pressed into the bones and stayed there like a quiet warning. In Ridgefield, the small mountain town nestled beneath a blanket of snow, the world looked like it had been dipped in silence. Snow-covered cabins sat like sleeping creatures beneath tall pine trees. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, and on the edge of the frozen lake, 2 figures carved long arcs in the glistening white surface. A man and a boy, their laughter briefly breaking the hush of winter. Reed Holloway adjusted his knit cap and looked over his shoulder. "Careful with that turn, champ," he called out. "I've got it." Caleb, just shy of 9, spun confidently on his skates, nearly toppling over, but laughing all the same. His cheeks were rosy, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. Reed chuckled, skating closer. "You're getting too good. Gonna leave your old man in the dust. You're not old," Caleb said. Just a little bit tired. That made Reed laugh harder than he expected. Tired was a good word. He'd been tired since the firehouse cut its budget, and he left the force. Tired since he lost Camille, his wife, to a sudden illness that took her in less than a month. Tired, but not broken. Not yet. They skated to the edge of the lake where their thermos waited, tucked next to a beat-up red backpack. Reed poured hot chocolate into 2 dented mugs, handed one to Caleb. "You miss her?" Caleb asked quietly, staring at the lake. Reed hesitated. "Every day, me too." Reed placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "But we're doing okay, aren't we?" Before Caleb could answer, the silence broke. A sharp crack rang out. Not close, but not far. Both turned toward the far end of the lake, where a stretch of older ice met the tree line. A large black SUV, new heavy, had veered from the snow-covered path and slid onto the lake. The wheels spun, then a louder crack. The front dipped, the vehicle tilted. "Dad," Caleb whispered. Reed didn't think years of instinct kicked in like a reflex. He shoved the backpack toward Caleb. "Run to the trail. If you see someone, wave them down. Do not come back. Understand?" "Dad, do you understand?" His voice was firm, but his eyes held every ounce of fear and love a father could feel in a single second. Caleb nodded. Reed turned and sprinted boots, crunching snow, until he dropped to his knees at the edge of the lake. He yanked off his coat, his gloves, anything that would slow him down. Then he slid forward. The SUV's rear had already started to sink, water creeping up the windows. Reed pounded forward on all fours to distribute his weight, ice groaning beneath him with every shift. Help a child's voice. Then another. Then a third. Triplets. Reed's pulse surged. He reached the vehicle just as the passenger window cracked wider from the water pressure. Inside, 3 little girls identical down to their winter coats were screaming. "Hold on!" Reed shouted, using his elbow to smash the back window. It cracked, but didn't give. Come on," he slammed again. Finally, the glass gave in with a shatter, sending freezing water rushing toward his skin. He reached in, grabbed the nearest girl, trembling, soaked eyes wide, and pulled her free. "Daddy," she whimpered. "I'm here," he whispered. "I've got you one by one." He fought the water and the breaking ice. His fingers bled from glass, his knees numbed against the cold. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop until the last girl was out. By now the SUV had nearly vanished, groaning as it sank fully into the depths. Reed crawled backward with the third girl in his arms, the other two huddled on the ice behind him. He was shaking uncontrollably every breath, like breathing glass. But the sound that stopped him was not the groaning ice. It was Caleb's voice. "Help us! Somebody." "Help the boy," cried from the trail where a couple hikers had come running. A man sprinted toward them with a blanket. Another dropped his backpack and pulled out a phone. Caleb dropped to his knees, hands clasped, eyes shut tight. "Please, please let them live," he whispered. "Please, don't let them die. Please, help my dad." Reed collapsed just as strong hands lifted the first girl from his arms. His vision blurred white and gold, flashing in and out. Someone shouted for paramedics. The wind howled across the lake. He looked up once more at Caleb, still praying with his eyes clenched tight, and then let go. Darkness took him. Sirens wailed in the distance, their sound fractured by the biting wind. Red and blue lights danced through the frosted pine trees as two ambulances and a rescue truck slid to a halt near the lake's edge. Snowflakes kept falling, as if nature hadn't yet realized something sacred had just taken place. The three little girls were wrapped in thermal blankets, now their lips still blue, tiny bodies trembling. The EMTs worked swiftly, applying warming packs and checking vitals with clinical precision. But their eyes, the girls' wide, fearful eyes, never left Reed, who lay motionless on a stretcher nearby. One of the EMTs hovered over him, inserting an IV and shouting his vitals. Core temps below 33 pulse, thready. "Let's get him now. He won't last another 10 minutes in this cold." Caleb stood to the side, hands clenched so tightly around his backpack that his knuckles had turned white. A paramedic tried to pull him away gently, but he shook his head. "I'm his son," he said softly. "Please, let me ride with him." The paramedic hesitated, then nodded. Inside the ambulance, Reed's face was pale lips tinged with violet. His body barely moved under the oxygen mask and layers of warming blankets. Caleb reached out and touched his father's hand. It was ice. "I prayed, Dad," Caleb whispered. "Like you taught me when Mom got sick. I asked him not to take you too." A tear slid down the boy's cheek as the ambulance sped off toward Ridgefield Medical Center, weaving through the narrow, snow-covered roads. Caleb didn't cry out. He didn't panic. He simply held his dad's hand like a lifeline, as if his touch alone could keep the flame alive. Back at the lake, the girls were transported in the second ambulance. They remained quiet, as if still in the trance of that icy horror. The woman riding with them, a young nurse, leaned down gently. "Can you tell me your names?" she asked, her voice soft. The girl on the left blinked, then whispered, "Emmy." The one in the middle murmured, "Elsie." The third, barely audible, said, "Evie." All three wore matching red coats and identical braids, but it was the look in their eyes that made the nurse pause. They weren't just scared. They were lost, in a way. Only children without anchors could be. "Where's your mommy or daddy?" she asked gently. None of them answered. At Ridgefield Medical Center, the small ER team sprang into motion. Reed was rushed into a trauma bay, dozens of hands working in silent coordination. Warming blankets, heated IV fluids, external heating units. His body shivered uncontrollably as the cold fought to keep him. For a moment, a nurse whispered under her breath, "He shouldn't have survived pulling out one, let alone 3. Caleb waited in the hallway, curled on a bench with the red backpack still clutched to his chest. A volunteer brought him cocoa, but it sat untouched. He stared straight ahead, eyes wide, heart thudding with a fear too big for someone so small. It wasn't long before the second ambulance arrived. The nurses gasped when the doors opened. Triplets, soaked, and near hypothermic. They were rushed into the pediatric unit, tiny forms on gurneys, eyes blinking against the fluorescent light. A nurse asked again, "Do you know your mom's name? Her number, anything still." No reply. The three girls clung to one another like a single being fractured into three parts. Their coats were taken, their vitals checked again, but they spoke only in whispers and only to each other. They refused food, even water, until a nurse brought a soft fleece blanket and placed it over all three. Only then did they relax, curling together like kittens beside a fire. They could only imagine. It wasn't until late afternoon that the storm let up. Outside, the world was still cloaked in white, but the hospital glowed with that particular kind of warmth that winter makes so precious light. Hope, the promise that not everything ends in ice. Reed had stabilized. His body was still weak, but his pulse was steady, his breathing deeper. A nurse placed a warm compress over his chest and quietly turned down the lights. Caleb was allowed to come in. He stepped carefully to the bed, afraid even his small presence might break something. Reed's hand twitched, then slowly lifted, reaching for his son. Caleb took it instantly. "I didn't leave," Caleb whispered. "Like you said." Reed opened his eyes just barely. His lips moved beneath the oxygen mask, forming one word. Good, then he squeezed his son's hand. In the hallway outside the pediatric unit, a storm of a different kind arrived. 10 sleek black Rolls-Royces rolled to a stop in the snow-covered parking lot, their engines humming like a fleet of ghosts. The hospital staff blinked in surprise as chauffeurs stepped out in matching coats, holding umbrellas against the fading snow. And then she stepped out, Evelyn Mercer, a woman of breathtaking beauty dressed in an immaculate winter coat, hair swept back like polished glass heels, clicking sharply against the pavement. She looked around the entrance like someone searching for air in a world suddenly too tight. The front nurse barely got a word in before Evelyn spoke. "I'm looking for 3 girls, Emmy, Elsie, and Evie. They're mine." Nurses scrambled. Within seconds, Evelyn was led down the hallway past the ER, past the trauma bays to the pediatric ward. She walked like she had a mission, but her hands trembled. When the door opened, the girls looked up. "Mommy," they cried in unison. She didn't say a word. Evelyn dropped to her knees and opened her arms. All 3 girls ran into her, burying their faces against her, as if trying to melt into her chest. Evelyn sobbed her perfect facade, cracking like lake ice in spring. I'm here. I'm so sorry. I was late. I'm here now." She held them so tightly it hurt. A nurse touched her arm gently. "Ma'am, there's someone you need to thank. They wouldn't have made it without him." Evelyn looked up, tears still fresh in her eyes, who the nurse nodded toward the other wing, the man who jumped into the lake. Reed awoke to the sterile glow of hospital lights and the soft beep of a heart monitor. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Everything felt too clean, too quiet, and the air was heavy with the unmistakable scent of antiseptic. He blinked slowly, his lashes crusted with frost that had melted long ago. His body ached from somewhere deep beneath the skin, like his bones remembered what his mind was trying to forget. Then came the voice. "You're awake." He turned his head slightly and winced at the effort. Standing at the foot of his bed was a woman, tall, elegant, with eyes the color of storm clouds and cheekbones that could slice stone. She wore a dark wool coat, but her face was pale, and her hands were tightly clasped, like she didn't trust them to stay steady. "I'm Evelyn Mercer," she said, taking a tentative step closer. The mother of the girls. Reed's brow furrowed. They're okay. His voice was little more than gravel. Evelyn nodded, eyes already brimming. Yes. Thanks to you. Reed tried to sit up but groaned as his muscles protested. Evelyn moved to help him instinctively, but stopped herself just short of touching him. You nearly died, she said softly. They told me you broke the window with your elbow, that the water was near freezing, that no one could have saved all three, but you did. Reed looked away. Anyone would have tried. No, Evelyn said, her voice tight. No, they wouldn't. There was a long pause. The only sounds were the hum of machines and the quiet exhale of Reed's breath. Then the door opened, and Caleb slipped in, holding a styrofoam cup with both hands. Hey, Dad, he whispered, eyes lighting up at the sight of him awake. Reed smiled faintly. Hey, champ. Caleb stepped closer, hesitating slightly when he saw Evelyn. She knelt down, meeting him at eye level. You must be Caleb, she said gently. I've heard so much about your courage. He gave a polite nod, unsure what to say. They were scared. He offered, but they didn't cry until they were safe. Evelyn's lips parted slightly, her breath catching. Thank you for calling for help, for praying, for keeping your dad alive. Caleb blushed and shuffled closer to Reed. Evelyn stood again, brushing imaginary lint from her coat. I know this is sudden, she said carefully, but I'd like to visit your home. To thank you properly, if you'll allow it. Reed blinked. It's nothing special. That's exactly what I need, she replied. Then softer. Something real. The next morning, under a pale sun that barely warmed the snow-drenched world, a black SUV, this one not submerged, rolled slowly through the pine-lined roads of Ridgefield. It stopped outside a modest log cabin, tucked back among the trees, with smoke curling from its chimney like an old lullaby. Evelyn stepped out her boots, crunching against the snow. Behind her, a bodyguard waited discreetly, but she waved him off. She walked up the path alone. The cabin was small, weathered wood, a porch with a sagging swing, and a welcome mat that had lost its lettering. But it smelled of pine and cinnamon, and when the door opened, it creaked like a house that had known both joy and sorrow. Please excuse the mess, Reed said as he ushered her inside. He wore a sweater with frayed cuffs and jeans that had seen better years, but he stood tall, back straight, as if dignity required no polish. Evelyn looked around the living room. There was a small wood-burning stove, a threadbare couch, and a wooden shelf lined with old books and model fire trucks. A snow globe sat in the corner filled with dust. But what caught her eye was the old cookie tin on the table, round faded blue with white swirls and a picture of Danish cookies on top. She froze. My grandmother had the exact same tin, she whispered. Used it for sewing needles and thread. Reed chuckled. This one, too. My wife's idea. Said if it looked like cookies, the kids would always open it and remember how to fix things instead of throw them away. Evelyn walked toward it almost reverently and opened the lid. Inside spools of thread, tiny scissors, and a worn thimble. She died, she asked softly. Reed nodded. Cancer fast. Caleb was 6. Evelyn's eyes flickered to the fireplace mantel where a small family photo sat. In it, Reed held a woman with soft eyes, and Caleb, much younger, hugged both. You still wear her watch, she noted, seeing the cracked leather band on his wrist. Reed glanced at it, stopped ticking the day she passed. But I keep it on. Why, so Caleb knows, he said, voice tight, that some things aren't gone just because they're quiet. Evelyn stared at him, and something long buried inside her shifted. something old and brittle. She hadn't cried when her divorce papers arrived. She hadn't cried when her father died, not even at the funeral. But now, standing in a stranger's cabin with the scent of firewood and cinnamon and quiet love, she felt the thaw begin. Outside, snow began to fall again, light soft flakes swirling like grace from above. Caleb burst in cheeks, flushed, holding something behind his back. "I found it," he said. He pulled out a drawing crayon on folded paper. It showed a lake, a man pulling children from the ice, and a boy praying beside a tree. Evelyn knelt to take it. Her fingers shook on the bottom in crooked letters. It read, "The Man Who Saved the Angels." She looked at Reed. He wasn't wealthy. His cabin barely had central heat. But he had something her world of luxury and power had stolen from her long-ago warmth. The next afternoon, Evelyn returned this time without the convoy of luxury or the cold veil of formality. No black coats, no sharp heels, just a long cream sweater, jeans tucked into worn boots, and a scarf that looked far too cozy to belong to a woman who regularly graced magazine covers. She held a thermos of cocoa in one hand and something else tucked beneath her coat. When Reed opened the door, he blinked in surprise. "You, again." "You sound disappointed," she replied, but her smile betrayed more warmth than her words. Reed stepped aside. "Not disappointed, just not used to visitors twice in a week." She walked into the cabin like someone who remembered something they never actually lived. The creak of the floorboards, the scent of pine, the faint hum of a space heater. It all slowed her breath in a way high-rise offices and penthouse silence never did. Caleb peeked out from behind the kitchen curtain. "We have marshmallows," he offered proudly. Holding up a half-used bag, Evelyn laughed. Perfect. They sat at the small wooden table, the same table where Camille had once sewn patches into Reed's work shirts and helped Caleb with spelling. Reed poured her a cup, then his own, and for a moment, the three sat like an odd family. Not yet one, but not strangers either. Evelyn placed a small object on the table, a framed photo of three giggling girls in Halloween costumes, all dressed as bumblebees, Evie, Elsie, and Emmy. They chose matching outfits every year, even when I begged them to try something different, she said with a wistful smile. This was the last Halloween with their dad. Reed didn't speak. He knew grief didn't need questions, just space to exhale. He passed away 2 years ago. Heart attack on a business trip in Milan. She stared into her cup. "I told the girls he fell asleep with dreams in his pockets," Reed murmured. "That's beautiful." It was a lie. "No," he said gently. It was love dressed in words that wouldn't scare them. Evelyn looked at him, really looked for the first time. His face was rough but kind. His hands bore the calluses of hard work, the veins of endurance. And on his wrist still was that broken watch. She reached toward it, He hesitated, then lifted his arm. She ran her fingers along the cracked leather band, the scratched glass face. The hands of the watch were stopped at 4:37. She passed at that time. She asked Reed. Nodded. I was holding her hand. Evelyn exhaled. "Why wear something that doesn't work?" He looked at her voice, quiet. "Because it reminds me of what matters. Time doesn't have to move to be meaningful. Some moments, they're enough to last a lifetime." Her fingers lingered a moment longer before she drew them back. Caleb, sensing the weight in the room, stood and scurried to the shelf. "Want to see something cool?" He reached up and brought down the cookie tin Evelyn had noticed the day before. He placed it in front of her and opened the lid with reverence. Inside there were needles, buttons, some yellowed thread, and a tiny fabric heart stitched with red yarn. "My mom made this," he said. Said every home needed a little patch of love in it. Evelyn stared at the tin, My grandma had the same one. She did. Caleb beamed. She kept peppermints in it, and dimes wrapped in foil for when I lost a tooth. Caleb giggled. That's way cooler than buttons. No, she said, her voice trembling. It's exactly the same. It meant someone cared enough to fix things. Reed watched as Evelyn gently touched the thimble, like it was something sacred. And perhaps to her, it was. There was something unraveling in her, a thread from the past. She hadn't realized she'd needed to pick up, the kind of memory that crept in softly, like the smell of snow in your hair after sledding, or the way a door creaked the same way in every childhood home. She closed the lid and placed it back on the shelf. I used to think power was about what you could buy, she said, what you could control. But after yesterday, all I can think about is what I almost lost. Reed tilted his head. And what did you find? She looked at him, her eyes steady. A man who gave everything to save what wasn't even his. A boy who prayed like it mattered. And a home where the broken things aren't thrown out, just held together with thread and memory. The words sat between them for a long moment. Outside, snow began to fall again. Soft, slow, gentle. Caleb ran to press his nose against the glass. It's sticking, he shouted. Evelyn stood brushing invisible crumbs from her sweater. I should go. The girls will want cocoa too. Reed walked her to the door. As she stepped out onto the porch, she turned back. Thank you, she said. Not just for the lake. For this, he nodded. Anytime she paused, then smiled. Maybe next time I'll bring cookies, real ones, not tins, he chuckled. I'll be waiting. And with that, she descended the steps, her boots crunching the snow, her scarf catching the wind like a memory being carried home. Inside, Reed sat back down. He looked at the tin, then at the watch, 37, and yet somehow something had just begun again. That evening, as the Ridgefield sky turned violet, and the wind whispered through pine branches like an old hymn, Reed tucked Caleb into bed, beneath his favorite quilt, a patchwork of worn flannel squares and fading baseball logos stitched together by Camille's hands long ago. Want the story or the song tonight? Reed asked softly. Caleb yawned. The song. Reed smiled and stood up. He walked over to the old radio on the windowsill, a bulky wood-framed relic from another era, its knobs worn smooth, its antenna eternally bent. He gave it the familiar tap on the left side, turned the dial slowly until static gave way to melody. Then, like it always did on nights like this, the opening chords of Stand By Me began to play. As Ben E. King's voice drifted through the small cabin, warm and steady, Reed let the music do the speaking. He sat by the edge of the bed, his fingers lightly brushing Caleb's hair. You think Mom hears it too? The boy asked, eyes heavy. I think she never stopped. Reed whispered, especially this song. Caleb nodded, then closed his eyes, his breathing softening with the lullaby of old vinyl and older memories. Outside the cabin, Evelyn stood frozen by the window, the snow crunching faintly beneath her boots. She hadn't meant to stay, only to drop off a small basket of scones the girls had helped her bake. But when she heard the song, she couldn't move. Stand By Me. It had been her mother's favorite too. Her own childhood rushed back in pieces. Summer nights on a sagging porch, swing her mother humming the tune while folding laundry. The old record player skipping at the same place, every time Evelyn had long since buried that memory beneath boardroom presentations and Wall Street forecasts, but now standing outside a humble cabin that smelled faintly of firewood and sugar, she felt 10 years old again. Safe, loved human. She didn't knock. Not tonight. She turned and walked quietly back toward her car, her boots sinking deeper into the snow with each step, as if the weight in her chest needed anchoring. The next morning, the Mercer estate came alive with more noise than it had heard in years. 3 little girls wrapped in oversized pajamas and fuzzy socks raced down the marble staircase like they were escaping a dream and running into something real. Evelyn stood at the bottom coffee mug, in hand, her silk robe barely tied, as the triplets collided into her with giggles and breathless chatter. "Can we go see the cabin today?" Emmy asked. "Please, Mommy." Evie begged. "We made a card." Elsie held up a crayon drawing of Reed and Caleb with hearts and a smiling snowman. "He's the best, even better than Santa." Evelyn laughed a real laugh from somewhere deep and unused. "We'll go," she promised. After breakfast, the girls cheered and disappeared into the kitchen, where a stunned housekeeper was already being given detailed instructions about pancake shapes and syrup ratios. Evelyn sipped her coffee and stared out the tall windows toward the tree line. She hadn't realized how quiet her home had become until noise came back like sunlight, until someone reminded her that laughter didn't need permission to enter a room. Reed was chopping wood outside when he heard the car again. He looked up to see Evelyn's SUV easing down the path, a bit more confident on the snow than the last time. 3 little faces pressed against the rear window, waving excitedly. Caleb ran out the door before the car even stopped. They came back. The girls spilled out like confetti racing toward him. "Hi, Caleb. Want to see our card?" "Guess what? We made pancakes with blueberry eyes." Ford raised an eyebrow. "Blueberry eyes." "It's a thing now," Caleb replied gravely. Evelyn stepped out last, holding a thermos and a paper bag. "Hot cider and cinnamon bread," she said. "We thought we'd trade." "For what?" Reed gestured to the woodpile. "Manual labor." She smiled. "We'll pass the girls," and Caleb ran inside, arguing over which song to play on the old radio. Evelyn lingered near the porch steps, watching Reed split a log clean in 2. "You ever take a break?" she asked. He paused and wiped sweat from his brow. "Splitting wood clears the mind." "And this place?" she asked, glancing around. "It's so quiet." "That's the point," he replied. "The world's loud enough without me adding to it." Evelyn stepped closer. "My world's loud. It always has been. Deadlines. Decisions. Too many zeros and not enough voices." Reed didn't answer right away. "Then you don't have to stay in it." She looked at him. "What if I already left and didn't know it?" Their eyes met, and in that silence there was something unspoken. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. 2 people standing on opposite ends of a frozen lake, not quite ready to walk across, but both finally wondering what the ice might hold beneath. Inside the cabin, "Stand by." Me started again a little louder. This time, one of the girls shouted, "That's our favorite." Evelyn blinked. "They've only heard it once." Reed smiled. "Once is enough if it finds the right heart." She looked down at the snow-covered path, then back toward the door. "Mind if I come in?" "You already did," Reed said quietly. And together, they stepped inside. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the pine-studded ridges of Ridgefield. When Evelyn offered to help Caleb clean up after the impromptu cider and cinnamon visit, the girls were sprawled on the rug near the wood stove, coloring with blunt crayons, and humming off-key. Reed had stepped outside to bring in more firewood, leaving the cabin in a hush, save for the soft scratch of crayons and the hum of the radio, now playing a jazz instrumental. Evelyn crouched near the wooden crate that served as Reed's tool chest, helping Caleb pick up a scattered mess of nails, pliers, and small screwdrivers. "Sorry," he muttered. "I knocked it over trying to reach a screwdriver." "No harm done," she said, brushing dust from her knees. Her voice dropped a little. "Your dad's really something." Caleb paused. "Yeah, he's the best person I know." Evelyn smiled, but as she reached to pick up a folded cloth, something underneath it caught her eye. A yellowed envelope edges, curled buried beneath a wrench and a coil of twine. She picked it up before Caleb could notice. There was no address, no stamp, just a name written in firm, slanted handwriting. Camille Evelyn's fingers froze. Part of her told her to put it back. Another part, the part that hadn't slept in years, the part still wrapped in the silk of grief and sleepless nights, held it gently, reverently, and stood up. She glanced at Caleb, who had moved to help the girls pick out colors, then quietly stepped onto the porch and unfolded the letter. It wasn't long. Camille. I don't know why I'm writing this. You'll never read it. You're already gone, and the house has grown too quiet without your voice, humming in the kitchen. Caleb asked today why we still keep the broken clock. I told him it's so time can stop for the things we don't want to lose. He laughed, but I didn't wear your watch, even though it doesn't tick, because I want to believe something of you still holds time for us, because I still try to be the man you saw when no one else did. I'm not angry. You left. I'm just tired. Some days I get up only because Caleb needs breakfast, or snow needs shoveling, but there's a hollowness I don't know how to fill. I hope wherever you are, you know that I'm trying to be the kind of good that doesn't need recognition, the kind of good you believed in. Love always. Read. Evelyn folded the paper slowly, her fingers trembling. There was something raw in the words, not polished, not performative, just truth as plain and jagged as grief itself. She pressed the letter against her chest without realizing it, as if to anchor the ache that had risen so suddenly in her own throat. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in her mourning. The loneliness she carried so well disguised in tailored suits and company reports found a quiet companion in this man who had loved and lost with such honesty. Behind her, the door creaked. Reed stood there, arms full of firewood, brow furrowed when he saw what she held. Evelyn started, then stopped. It fell out. I didn't mean to. Reed set down the wood slowly. His jaw clenched, but he didn't speak, just stood in the golden wash of fading sunlight, eyes locked on hers. I shouldn't have read it, she said, but I'm glad I did. Silence stretched between them. I wrote that 6 months after she passed. He finally said, never mailed it. Didn't know where to send it. Maybe I just needed to say the words. They were beautiful, she said softly. Painful, but beautiful. He gave a tight nod and looked out toward the horizon. Sometimes I wonder if she's still watching, if she saw the lake. The girls? She did, Evelyn said. Her voice shook. And maybe she sent you. Maybe. Maybe it takes someone who's been broken to know how to save something fragile. Reed didn't answer, but in his eyes something shifted, the kind of shift that takes months, sometimes years. A thaw, a loosening of the tightly wound ache that had lived in his chest for too long. Inside, the girls began to sing off-key and giggling, their voices rising and falling like little bells. Evelyn smiled through tears she didn't wipe away. Reed opened the door and gestured for her to come back in. She stepped forward but paused. I put the letter in my coat pocket, she admitted. Near my heart. It just felt like it belonged somewhere warm. He looked at her for a long moment. He said quietly, if you want. It's not a secret, just a piece of something. I didn't think anyone else would understand. I understand, she whispered, and then she stepped past him, back into the cabin. Not a guest now, but something more tender, more uncertain, like someone searching for her place in a story that hadn't finished being written. That night, as snow fell gently outside, Evelyn helped Caleb hang new mittens by the fire, while Reed watched from the doorway. The letter was still in her pocket, still close to her heart, and for the first time in years, She didn't feel the need to run. The Mercer estate looked like something out of a winter fairy tale. Snow draped the ivy-covered walls like lace, and the long driveway sparkled under early evening lights. But what struck Reed most, when he pulled up in his battered pickup with Caleb, was the sound of laughter spilling out from the grand entryway. Not polite, echoing laughter, the kind often found at charity galas, but the belly-deep, nose-crinkling kind only children can produce. It rang out from the wide marble stairs and bounced off chandeliers like it had waited too long to be heard in that house. Evelyn stood at the door, coatless, despite the chill waving as they approached. "You came," she said, a little surprised at her own relief. "You invited us," Reed replied with a shrug. "Didn't want to be rude." "Dad ironed his shirt," Caleb added proudly. "I did not." Reed shot him a look. "It was just under a pile of laundry and got flattened." Inside, warmth enveloped them immediately, both in temperature and something else. Something less definable. The scent of cinnamon and rosemary hung in the air, and soft jazz played in the background, a nod to Reed's old radio. The girls rushed down the stairs, Emmy nearly tripping over herself in excitement. "Caleb." "We made name cards for the table, and we made pie," Elsie announced. "3 kinds," Evie added, holding up fingers dusted with flour. Evelyn ushered them all toward the dining room, a space that once hosted CEOs and dignitaries, now transformed into a setting of handmade placemats and mismatched cutlery. A pinecone centerpiece sat on the linen runner, clearly assembled by small hands and big hearts. Caleb's eyes widened as he took his seat. "This is fancy." Evelyn laughed. "Only because you're here." Reed remained quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. It was the kind of space Camille would have loved imperfect in the most meaningful ways. The girls chattered away, each trying to tell a different version of how the pies came to be. Elsie dropped the apple slices. Only once, Evie burned the crust, just a little. Emmy ate the cinnamon. I tasted it. As laughter filled the room again, Evelyn leaned toward Reed and whispered, "This was never what I planned for my life." He met her eyes. "What did you plan? Control. Balance sheets. A world where everything had a place." And now she looked down at the girls and Caleb, arms tangled faces full of joy. "Now I want a world that has a pulse." Dinner was hearty and full of small interruptions, spilled cider, second helpings, giggles. But it wasn't until dessert arrived that something quietly remarkable happened. Evelyn brought out 3 pies, apple pecan and blueberry, and placed them proudly in the center of the table. Caleb leaned in, eyes wide. "That smells like heaven." "You get the first slice," Evelyn said with a smile. But instead of diving in, Caleb turned to his father. "Can I?" Reed nodded. Caleb stood and gently cut the apple pie. He placed 1 large slice on a plate and walked it carefully around the table past Reed, past the girls, and stopped in front of Evelyn. "For you," he said, placing the plate down. "Dad says, you give away the best part." First Evelyn blinked. "He does, yeah?" Caleb sat back down. "He says if you give away the good stuff, you never run out. Somehow, you always have more." Reed rubbed the back of his neck, looking a little sheepish. "Just a thing I say." "It's more than that," Evelyn said quietly, her throat tightening. She looked down at the slice of pie, flaky, golden, slightly crooked, and for a second, she saw her mother's hands flour-dusted and gentle, teaching her to cut butter into dough. She picked up her fork, took a bite, and smiled. "It's perfect." Evie grinned. "That's 'cause it's got our hearts in it." "And cinnamon," Emmy added helpfully. Evelyn laughed, that too. After dinner, the children disappeared into the den, where a stack of puzzles and old Christmas movies kept them occupied. Reed wandered toward the patio, standing just past the glass doors. Evelyn joined him, arms crossed against the cold. "The kids don't notice," she said, nodding toward the window. "But this place used to echo. It was all marble and silence. I didn't know what I was doing." "None of us do," Reed replied. "We just try not to break what we love." She looked at him. "You haven't?" "Not yet," he said. "But I've lost enough to know the risk." Silence stretched between them again. "Comfortable this time. I found your letter again last night," she said. Voice barely above the wind. "I read it twice." He didn't flinch. "Did it help?" She nodded. "It reminded me that grief doesn't have to be loud to be real, and that sometimes broken watches still keep something precious." Reed turned toward her, his expression softer than she'd seen it before. "You don't need to fix everything, Evelyn." She held his gaze. "Maybe not. But I think I'd like to be part of something that doesn't need fixing, just holding." He said nothing, but the look in his eyes answered for him. Inside, the radio hummed on. Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet, steady like a promise being whispered into the dark. Reed had always believed goodbyes should be quiet. No tears, no speeches, just a door closing gently behind you. He stood alone that morning in the cabin, stuffing flannel shirts into a canvas duffel that had seen more campgrounds than hotel rooms. His movements were mechanical, each fold of fabric a small surrender. Outside the window, the sun rose reluctantly over Ridgefield, filtered through white-gray clouds that promised more snow. He paused to look at the worn floorboards, where the triplets had once sat, giggling in a tangle of crayon drawings and mismatched socks. Caleb's puzzle still sat unfinished on the corner table. A single mitten Evie's, if he remembered the embroidery, had somehow been left behind. He picked it up, ran his thumb over the hand-stitched E, and placed it gently in the pocket of his jacket. No note, no final visit, no drawn-out explanation. That was the kind of goodbye Evelyn's world would understand. Best, clean, efficient, and without complication. He knew she would return to the city. She had a world waiting. One built on structure, on control, on expectations. And Reed had none of those things to offer. No foundation, no future. Just a cabin, a boy, and a past stitched together by firewood and memory. Caleb watched from the hallway, small hands gripping the doorframe. "You're really leaving?" Reed zipped the bag without looking up. "They'll be going home soon. Back to the city. It's not our place anymore, Caleb. But we made it ours." Reed knelt and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I know, buddy, but this kind of life, they don't stay in it. They visit and then they leave." Caleb's lip trembled. "But what if they wanted us to stay?" Reed offered a tight smile. Then they'd say it. He turned toward the fireplace and reached into the cabinet below. From it, he pulled out 3 small pairs of mittens, each hand-stitched and carefully repaired by Camille in years past. They were old but warm, and the yarn was still soft with use. He laid each pair on the coffee table, and beside them placed a folded strip of paper. He wrote with slow, deliberate strokes, "Don't let winter take your smile." No name, just the message. That was enough. At the Mercer estate, Evelyn was on the phone, half listening to her assistant read through an itinerary. Meetings board, reviews, a gala in Aspen. None of it felt real anymore. She wandered through her glass and gold kitchen like a stranger in her own home. Ms. Mercer, the assistant, asked, "Are you still with me?" "Yes," Evelyn replied distantly. "Email the documents. I'll look them over later." She hung up and turned toward the den, The girls were unusually quiet, sitting together by the bay window. Emmy held her favorite stuffed rabbit. Elsie was curled up in a blanket, thumb near her mouth, like she hadn't done in years. Evie stared out the frosted glass. Silent, Evelyn walked in and knelt beside them. "What's wrong, darlings?" "They're gone," Evie whispered. Evelyn frowned. "Who's gone?" "Caleb and his dad." Emmy murmured. "They didn't come today." "They always come today," Elsie added. "We waited." Evelyn stood slowly. Something clenched in her chest. "Maybe they had errands," she said too quickly. "I'll call." But then she saw it, on the side table near the entryway, 3 small bundles, mittens carefully folded, and beneath them a strip of paper. She reached for it with a hand that suddenly trembled. "Don't let winter take your smile." The girls were already crying, not loudly, but the kind of quiet, aching sadness that made Evelyn feel like the air had been sucked from the room. She stood frozen for several seconds, then turned sharply. "Get dressed," she said. The girls blinked up at her. "We're going to find them." The snow had grown heavier by the time Evelyn's SUV hit the trail leading back toward the cabin. The girls were in the back seat, still in their pajamas beneath coats, breath fogging the windows as they looked for any sign, footprints, tire tracks, anything. "There," Emmy shouted suddenly. "Those are their tracks." The SUV climbed the hill slowly, and as they rounded the final bend, Evelyn slammed the brakes. There, just ahead, was Reed, his duffel on his back. Caleb beside him, trudging through the snow toward the old county road. Evelyn flung open the door before the vehicle fully stopped. The cold slapped her cheeks, but she barely noticed. She ran, breath-jagged coat flaring behind her like a storm. "Reed," he turned. Time stilled. Evelyn stopped a few feet from him, her face flushed, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. Something wild and scared and painfully human. "Why?" she asked Reed. Lowered his eyes. "You're going back to your world. I figured it was time we returned to ours. You didn't even say goodbye. Didn't think you needed one." She stepped closer. "I don't need one. Reed, I need." Her voice broke. "I need you." Silence fell heavy as the snow. Then Caleb's small voice. "We didn't want to leave." Evie ran toward him, throwing her arms around his neck. "We made you pictures," Emmy cried, tears falling fast. "We still want pie nights," Elsie added between sobs. Reed looked down at the chaos of children clinging to one another in the snow. Then he looked at Evelyn. No makeup, no armor, just a woman reaching across everything she thought she knew. "You sure about this?" he asked. She stepped into him, placed a hand against his chest. "I've never been more sure of anything." The storm came in the night. Heavy snow swirled down from the dark sky, coating Ridgefield in a thick, soft silence. By morning, the world had been transformed into a blank canvas rooftops. Roads, even trees, hushed beneath a fresh white veil. Everything seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for a new story to be written. Evelyn stood in the foyer of her estate, her fingers tightening around a half-drunk cup of coffee. The girls were nowhere to be seen. No patter of feet, no giggles, just stillness. Too still, she walked down the hall and peeked into the den. Empty, their blankets lay folded untouched. The coloring books remained open where they'd been left the night before. Her breath quickened. "Elsie," she called, "I've answer." She climbed the stairs, knocking gently on the bedroom doors. No response. Panic bubbled up inside her like a sudden fever. Emmy Evie, she flung open the girls' shared room. The beds were empty, the comforters kicked off. A window near the corner stood slightly ajar, a trail of snow dusting the sill, and beneath it a small step stool. Evelyn froze. It wasn't until she looked outside that she saw them, a trail of tiny boot prints leading across the snow-blanketed lawn, heading through the iron gate and down the slope toward the trees. "Oh my God," she whispered. The prints were uneven, 3 sets side by side, weaving through the snow like braids unraveling in the wind. Evelyn ran, coat flying behind her scarf, forgotten. Her boots sank deep into the drifts, but she didn't stop. Every breath came in short bursts, fogging the cold air in front of her. The prints led into the forest trail. She knew where they were going. The cabin. Inside the cabin, the fire had long since died down to embers, but warmth still lingered in the walls. The girls sat huddled together on the rug, each wearing the mittens Reed had left. In their hands, they clutched small pieces of paper, crayon drawings, hearts, and one child's attempt at writing. The words, "Please stay." Caleb sat across from them wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide with worry. "They showed up 10 minutes ago," he told Reed. Voice tight. Said they didn't want the big house. Said they needed this. Reed knelt in front of them, heart hammering. "You walked here alone." Emmy nodded. "We followed our steps from yesterday." Evie sniffled. "It's not home without you." Reed didn't know what to say. The ache in his chest was too big, too tangled. He reached out, drawing them all into his arms. And that's where Evelyn found them through the window, breathless heart in her throat, as she watched her daughters wrapped in the arms of the man who had once pulled them from the ice. She opened the door, snow swirling in behind her. Reed looked up, unsure of what came next, but Evelyn didn't speak. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes never leaving his until she was standing just inches away. The girls looked up from the blanket of arms and scarves and leaned into their mother. "We didn't mean to scare you," Elsie whispered. Evelyn knelt and gathered them close. "You scared me more than you'll ever know, but you also reminded me what really matters." She looked up at Reed. "I grew up in a house filled with things, chandeliers, art books we never read, but I never once heard the words, 'Don't let winter take your smile.'" She smiled faintly, "And I've never seen my daughters run so far for anything before." Reed stood slowly unsure. "I thought I was doing the right thing, giving you back your world." Evelyn shook her head. "You are our world." Now the room fell still. Outside, the wind softened. Inside, the fire sparked again, as if the cabin itself had waited for these words. Later that evening, after warm soup and mismatched socks, and a quiet round of Stand By Me humming from the radio, the girls drifted off to sleep in a tangle on the couch. Caleb snored softly in the corner, curled beneath his quilt. Reed and Evelyn sat near the fire, wrapped in silence. She looked at the photo on the mantel, Camille Reed and a young Caleb. There was no bitterness in her eyes, only deep respect. She must have been extraordinary. Evelyn said. "She was," Reed replied, "and still is in here." He tapped his chest. Evelyn nodded. "I never thought I'd find someone who could make space for both the past and the future." He turned toward her. "You don't have to choose one." She looked down, her voice barely above the crackle of the flames. "I used to think love had to be earned, that it came with conditions, performance, perfection. But this, what you and Caleb gave us, it was just given. Like warmth." Reed studied her for a moment. "Do you know what warmth is, Evelyn?" She smiled faintly. "Tell me." "It's someone lighting a fire even when they're cold themselves." Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder, and in the stillness of the cabin, beneath the watchful gaze of snowfall and pine, they stayed that way. Two hearts learning that sometimes the footprints left in snow led not to a goodbye, but to the place we were always meant to return to. The sky over Ridgefield was all blue and silver. The next morning, the kind of winter day that arrived like a truce. The storm had passed, the snow lay untouched, and the world seemed to hold its breath, not in fear, but in quiet reverence. Inside the cabin, the scent of cinnamon lingered, faintly mingling with the earthy smell of wood smoke. A patch of sunlight spilled across the floorboards, warming the room inch by inch, like a secret only the morning knew how to tell. Evelyn stood by the window, arms folded, watching the girls sleep in a tangle of blankets. Caleb lay on the other couch, one arm flung over his eyes, snoring softly. Reed across the room stoked the fire with slow practiced motions. She turned to look at him. No chauffeur, no security, no calls from Manhattan. Just this, she smiled faintly. Do you realize it's the first time I've felt like a mother in years? Reed looked over his shoulder. Then I hope you stay long enough to feel it every day. Evelyn stepped closer, her hands absently brushing the threads of her scarf. You always speak like that. Like what? Like someone who remembers what it's like to be cold, he shrugged. I do. She sat beside the fire, studying his face in the glow. You know, when I first saw you carrying them out of that lake, I thought you looked like someone who'd do anything for a child. Any child. But I didn't realize until last night that it wasn't just bravery. It was something more. Reed tilted his head. What warmth, she paused, the kind you can't fake, the kind that comes from having lost so much that the only thing left to do is give. Reed rested the poker against the wall. I didn't think anyone noticed. I think that's what makes it real, she said. There was a beat of silence. Then she added, do you remember what you told me back in your workshop about Camille? About trying to be the man she believed you were? He nodded slowly. Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, weathered piece of paper. The letter, I kept it, she whispered. It's wrinkled, and the ink's a little smudged. But I read it every night since you gave it to me. And last night, I realized something. Reed waited silent. You still are that man, she said, the one she believed in. But you're also something else now, something more. You're the man who saved 3 strangers, who raised a son who prays instead of panics, who gave my daughters their laughter back. She looked up, eyes glassy, and you did it without expecting anything in return. Reed swallowed hard. You know, he said quietly. For a long time, I thought all I had left to give the world was what I'd already lost, that maybe my best chapters had already been written. They haven't, she said, reaching for his hand. They're just beginning. Caleb stirred behind them, groaning. Did someone eat the last cinnamon roll? Reed turned with a smirk. No, but I'm tempted now. Evie sat up and blinked. Did we sleep here again? Evelyn chuckled. Looks like it. The girls ran to hug her, wrapping their arms around her waist like ivy. Reed watched as she bent to kiss the tops of their heads, tucking hair behind small ears and whispering promises. Only mothers know how to make. Caleb stood and stretched. We should make pancakes. With blueberry eyes, Emmy asked. Obviously, Caleb replied, rolling his eyes. Reed stood and moved toward the kitchen. Evelyn followed, pulling her sleeves up. I burn toast, she warned. Then you're on syrup duty, he replied, handing her a ladle. It was a strange ballet. Mismatched ingredients, spilled flour laughter echoing off low ceilings. But somehow, it worked. By the time the pancakes hit the plates, the cabin felt more like a home than ever before. As they all sat around the tiny kitchen table, shoulder to shoulder, knees touching, Evelyn looked around and whispered almost to herself. We don't need a mansion. Reed raised a brow. Excuse me, she smiled. I was just thinking, we don't need a mansion to be a family. We just need space to be ourselves, even if that means sharing syrup, Reed teased. Especially then. The girls giggled. Caleb grinned. Evelyn looked at Reed, her eyes full. "I was so cold for so long," she said. "And I didn't even realize it." He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "Some people don't need heat to survive. Just someone who's warm enough for both of them." Outside the window, snow began to fall again. Soft and slow, like a curtain being drawn on the past. But inside the cabin, 6 heartbeats pulsed in rhythm. 6 chairs. 6 plates. 6 places at a table that once fed 2. And in that quiet space, without fanfare or ceremony, a new kind of love had taken root. Not loud or dramatic, but steady and sure. The kind of love that warms a house and keeps it warm. Spring came slowly to Ridgefield, like a cautious guest, knocking at the door of winter's long rain. Snowdrifts melted into rivulets that danced down hillsides. The lake finally gave up its ice, and the pine trees stood a little taller, beneath skies that no longer looked heavy with gray. At the edge of the woods, the old cabin remained, but something about it had changed. The firewood was stacked higher. Now, the porch swing no longer creaked alone, and tiny pairs of boots stood in a jumbled line just outside the door. 3 pink, 1 red, and 1 pair of worn brown sneakers, still too big for Caleb, but growing into them fast. Inside the heart of the home beat louder than ever. Caleb sat cross-legged on the rug, teaching the triplets how to play checkers with bottle caps and pine cones. Emmy kept trying to eat the pine cones. Evie argued over the rules. Elsie just laughed. The radio played in the background, faint, scratchy, but still clear enough for "Here Comes the Sun" to wrap itself around the moment like a soft ribbon. Reed stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, flipping pancakes with the kind of quiet pride known only to fathers. The cabin smelled like maple syrup coffee and something else. Contentment. Evelyn leaned against the counter, one arm wrapped around herself, the other nursing a mug of tea. "This isn't what I thought life would look like," she said. Reed raised an eyebrow. "Too much syrup," she smiled. "Too much heart." He flipped another pancake. "You want less." "Not a chance." They moved around each other with the ease of 2 people who had learned to share silence without needing to fill it. No contracts, no performance, just presence. Caleb poked his head up from the living room. "Dad, they're cheating." "I'm not," Evie shouted. Evelyn called back. No cheating before breakfast. After breakfast, Emmy asked innocently. "We'll negotiate," Reed replied. Laughter erupted from the floor. Evelyn turned back to Reed, her expression softer now. "Do you think she'd be okay with this?" He didn't need to ask who she meant. "I think Camille would have liked you," he said. "You both boss people around, but for all the right reasons." "I'm not bossy," Evelyn murmured, pretending to be offended. He smirked. "You're right. You're terrifying in the most elegant way." Then more seriously, she'd be proud. "Not just of me. Of this, of us," Evelyn's voice lowered. "You know, I used to think strength meant standing alone. I thought that love, real love, made you soft, vulnerable, breakable." And now, she looked toward the living room where her daughters were lying on their bellies, beside a boy who used to pray in silence for someone to stay. "Now I think love makes you braver." Reed didn't respond right away. He reached into the drawer near the stove, pulled out a small velvet pouch, and walked to the table. He set it down in front of Evelyn without a word. She blinked. "What's this?" Open it. Inside was the broken watch, the face still cracked, the leather band worn thin. It hadn't ticked in years. She looked up confused. "I'm not fixing it," he said. "I want it to stay like that." "Why?" "Because time stopped once for me, the moment Camille left, and for a long time I thought that was the end of everything that mattered." His voice was steady, but now I know sometimes time stops, so something new can begin. Evelyn's eyes glistened. You're giving it to me. I'm sharing it with you." He stepped closer. "So you never forget what we walked through to get here." She clutched the watch to her chest, as if it had weight beyond what metal and glass could hold. "I won't forget." Outside, birds chirped in the treetops. The wind no longer bit it, brushed, and down by the lake the ice was gone, revealing still waters beneath a sky, the color of forgiveness. Later that afternoon, as the sun bathed the cabin in gold, Evelyn stood on the porch, holding a pitcher of lemonade, while Reed sat nearby, mending a step with a hammer and a stubborn nail. The girls were making daisy crowns. Caleb was helping or getting in the way, depending on who you asked. "Do you ever miss the city?" Reed asked. Evelyn looked out across the hills. "Sometimes, but not the noise or the pressure." "I think I mostly just miss the illusion that I was in control," he nodded. "Hard to let go of that." "It is, but it's easier when you find something worth holding instead." He paused, then smiled, like sticky-fingered children and crooked porch steps. "And a man who knows how to build a home with nothing but kindness and grit," he said. "Yes." He set the hammer down. "You make it easy." "No," she said. "You make it worth it." Their eyes met again, not with the urgency of new love, but with the quiet certainty of something earned, something rooted. That night, when the last laugh had faded and the last story was told, the cabin glowed from within, like a lantern in the woods. 6 people, 1 for bore, and a feeling that needed no definition. Reed stood at the mantel, placing the broken watch beside the photo of Camille. Evelyn joined him, slipping her hand into his. "It's time," she said. He looked at her. For what? She smiled. For everything. Some houses are built with nails and lumber, but the ones that last, the ones that save us, are built with 6 heartbeats, and the man who was warm enough to carry them all. And just like that, a frozen lake gave the world 6 warm hearts and a second chance at love. If this story touched you even just a little, we'd love to know. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below and let us know. It always warms our hearts to see how far kindness can travel. And if you believe the world could use more stories like this, gentle, hopeful, and human, please consider subscribing to Soul Moments Story. It helps us continue sharing the kind of love that doesn't always make the headlines, but makes life worth living. Thank you for spending time with us today. From our hearts to yours, we're grateful you're here. Until next time, stay kind, stay warm, and never stop believing in quiet miracles.